Hi guys, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Here is group 1. Today we would like explain about language, cognition, and culture. So here is our member. First is Siti Norain binti Sule, Mirdawati, Sabda Rahayu Asifa Wardani, Trikasih Radaning Sarkan, and the last is Tata Cahaya Berliana. Let's start it. So our submaterial today, the first is language and perception, second is word, third is linguistic categories and culture, fourth is discourse pattern and culture, the last is language, social class, and cognition. So I would like to explain about verbal hygiene. What is the verbal hygiene? What is the work of verbal hygiene, and what is the example? So the definition about verbal hygiene is as stated by Cameron, motley collection of discourse and practices through which people attempt to clean up language and make its structure or its use conform more closely to their ideals of beauty, truth, efficiency, logic, correctness, and civility. So the work of verbal hygienists. Verbal hygienists enjoy thinking and arguing about words, correcting and writing of others, and looking things up in dictionaries and usage guides. This activity are born of the urge to improve and clean up the language. The example of verbal hygiene. Angela to her college. I was sitting quietly drinking my tea, minding my own business, and suddenly the fourth person burst in and shouted, "What are you doing here? Get back to work. You know that shipment's overdue. Bloody check. I'm entitled to my tea break." "Jim, you are. She's a vampire. But what's all this four-person stuff? I bet you wouldn't use that term for a man. Political correctness, gone mad." Verbal hygiene, thought-provoking term used by Deborah Cameron to describe how people respond to the urge to meddle in matters of language. What constitutes proper, correct, and acceptable usage in a range of contexts to using language as a political weapon. Example above. Deliberate adoption of overly non-sexist usage, such as four-person or chairperson, often leads to accusation of political correctness. Example: crippled, disabled, person with a disability, physically impaired, challenged, nigger, black person, person of color.
Okay, right. I'm Sabda Rahayu Wardani. I will explain about worth, or as we know as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It is from Benjamin Lee, which is an American anthropological linguist who developed this hypothesis, and his collaboration with his teacher named Edward Sapir, and it is talk about human language determines perceptions. It is divided into three types. The first one is vocabulary and cognition. The second one is linguistic determinism, and the last is grammar and cognition. Vocabulary and cognition. Language is a structure that only humans and animals have. Mind and language are one and conscience. It is already in the brain once humans are born. Ward and Sapir explain the relationship between language and mind is possible because thinking is an attempt to associate words or concept to get a conclusion through the medium of language. the relationship between language, thought, and reality has fascinated linguists and philosophers. The particular word selected to describe or label objects often influence people's perception and behavior. For the example, don't throw your cigarette butts in there. It is dangerous. Why not? The label says empty. Well, there's no gasoline in there, but there's plenty of explosive vapor. So watch out. It means around gasoline drums labeled as empty, people would smoke or even toss in cigarette stubs, despite the facts that they were full of potentially explosive vapor. Then, the second one is linguistic determinism. It is divided into two types. The first one is the strong form, is generally labeled linguistic determinism. This type believes that people from different cultures think differently because of differences in their language. Then the second, the sociolinguist would accept such a strong claim, but most accept the weaker claims of linguistic relativity. This language influences perceptions, thought, and at least potentially behavior. Then the last is grammar and cognition. Grammatical categories such as tense, aspect, and gender encode aspect of reality differently in different language. The general point is implication for the way speaker of different language culture filter or cut up reality. It is widely accepted that certain concepts may be more codable or easier to express in some language than in others, and the areas of experience which are important to cultures tend to get grammatically in their language. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Linguistic categories and culture. Native American and Australian Aboriginal language are often cited as examples that wrongly refute popular misconceptions about primitive language. For example, mistaken claims that simple societies can have complex grammars. Quechua, a Native American language, for example, requires a grammatical classification of nouns based on whether they are visible or not. And while French require every noun to be assigned to one of two genders, gerbil, an Australian Aboriginal language, has 4 such categories. Using Western criteria, the traditional nomadic lifestyle of the Aboriginal people of Australia seems very simple. Their culture, however, is thousands of years old, and their language are amongst the most interesting and grammatically complex that have been researched. Every noun in gerbil belongs to one of the 4 classes. Consequently, whenever a gerbil speaker uses a noun in a sentence, The noun must be preceded by one of the four classifiers, such as Bai, Balan, Balam, or Bala. The language provides a means of encoding a community's knowledge, beliefs, and value, its culture. Tahitians don't make a distinction between sadness and sickness, for instance, using the same words or both. This accurately represents their belief that sadness or sickness can be attributed to an attack by evil spirits, a belief that way initially seemed odd to someone from Western culture. When we use a language that makes subtle distinction between plants on the basis of their medical properties, or which encode important biological and environmental knowledge that may not be obvious to outsiders, we lose information that may be very difficult to retrieve. Australian Aboriginal people know how to survive in the desert. Encoded in their language is information about which plants to eat and which to cook, which provide water, and so on. The cause of language loss. Language loss also initiates the loss of insights about human perception. Example 11 provides just three examples from a number of semantic distinctions available to Tuyuka speakers through their grammar to indicate how much trust the listener should put in the information being offered. Sample 11. Diga apewi, I saw him play soccer with my own eyes. It is a visual effects. Diga apewi. I don't exactly how to say it. I saw him play soccer with my own eyes. The three, diga apehi inferential avis, I saw him play soccer with my own eyes. It is reasonable to assume he plays soccer.
Discourse patterns and culture. So discourse patterns and culture is always a problem between these two. About this material, I make a statement that in some place, the discourse patterns are used to communicate with each other, to build an information among two or more people. To illustrate, in Australia, there's a majority and minority among the people. If both this majority or minority use the same language, there's always a problem. It depends on the discourse patterns. So discourse patterns are the important thing to use to avoid misunderstandings, to communicate with each other and share information. The intertwining of language, culture, and perception is evident when we examine research on patterns of interaction too. Cultural differences between the discourse patterns of the majority and minority culture can often have serious consequences, as the research of Diana Edis comparing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians demonstrates. Even and perhaps especially when both groups apparently use the same language, culturally different patterns of interaction can be a source of misunderstanding. Regardless of the particular language being spoken, Aboriginal society throughout Australia places great importance on indirectness. It is important to avoid being intrusive. This involves giving other people interactional privacy, a crucial mechanism in a society where there is frequently little physical privacy. In discourse, this socio-cultural norm is indicated in a number of ways. If you want information from an Aboriginal person, it is important to follow the discourse rules.
Okay, next is language, social class, and cognition. So Worf's claim about the relationship between language, thought, and society really thoroughly. One of the benefits was a more detailed study of vernacular varieties and a very clear recognition that dialect differences were comparatively superficial aspect of language which couldn't conceivably have consequence for different ways of thinking. So whether you use a single or multiple negative construction, whether you mark past tense explicitly or not, which pronoun you use in the phrase between you and I or me. These are not certainly linguistic differences which can support an argument about cognitive deficiency. They are relatively superficial examples of language variation with no possible serious cognitive consequences. Okay, maybe that's all from my explanation, and thank you.